Throughout the ancient Eastern Mediterranean, various peoples were known to use a particular type of dagger, which the Greeks called the akinakes or akinaka, including the Persians, the Medes, the Caspians, and of course the Greeks themselves. The weapon is most famous, however, for forming part of the Scythian triad, a trio of objects commonly found in burials across the Eurasian steppe during the first millennium BC. They seem to have originated on the steppe, with an early example being found in the tomb of Arzan II in the Republic of Tuva, dated to the late 7th century BC. The pommels of these weapons were initially undecorated, but they eventually came to feature either antennae, abstract designs, or animal-style art, and those designs have been the basis for classification for over a century. What stands out among the animal designs, however, is the presence of paired birds of prey, whose heads face each other, and who often take the form of the mythological griffin, so much so that griffin daggers form their own subtype. At one time it was thought that the presence of antennae on these weapons derived from the influence of the Celts, and although that idea is still controversial among some archaeologists, what does seem to be clear is that the presence of not only antennae, but just the stylization of the pommels on these daggers themselves, probably has its start in the Carpathian Basin sometime around the 9th or the 8th century BC, and then it spread eastward into the Pontic-Caspian steppe. This interpretation would appear to be backed up by the fact that there have not been daggers with antennae or any sort of stylization found along the Black Sea coast before they show up in the Carpathian region during that period. By the 6th century, however, the presence of stylized pommels along the steppe appears to have been prevalent enough that smiths began crafting animal-style art on the weapons, and this is where the griffin daggers begin to make an appearance. There is a problem with these daggers, however, and that problem is that although griffin daggers are heavily concentrated in several regions, notably around the Altai Mountains, as the daggers spread out from that area, the pommel designs change to claws or antennae or, in some cases, cats. But there are still enough finds to suggest some sort of broad cultural continuum. Initially, they appear to have been fairly rare, but by the 5th century BC they had spread across the steppe, with the daggers being located in the Volga-Ural region, western Siberia, the Altai Mountains, and even as far west and east as the Carpathian Basin and northern China respectively. Despite that apparent cultural zone, however, it's not at all clear where this design actually originated, and it seems that the presence of the griffins is actually lacking in the art of Central Asia prior to this development. So where did this stylization come from? Well, to this day that is still not entirely certain, but it is known that they show up no earlier than the first half of the 6th century BC, and the stylization lasts approximately a century, with archaeological finds ceasing in the very late 5th or the very early 4th centuries. Technically speaking, the earliest dates archaeologists have for daggers which have two birds of prey on the pommel are several finds from the early 6th century in cemeteries in northern China, but the heads are not facing each other and they are not griffins, so the idea of a North Chinese origin is still up in the air. In the mid-6th century, however, griffin daggers do begin showing up in the Tagar culture, located in today's Republic of Tuva, and they also show up in several burials farther west along the Elbe River around the same time. Essentially, the two views on where griffin daggers began is that they started in one of these two locations, and then they spread east or west respectively. There is probably a stronger likelihood that it spread from west to east, towards the Minisink Basin where the Tagar culture flourished between the 8th and the 1st centuries BC, because there was a much greater concentration of these weapons in the second half of the 6th century in that area, while finds from the Elbe River tend to date from the first half, so those finds are earlier, but this is still not entirely certain. The daggers do, however, tend to be one of three types in terms of composition. The griffin daggers found further west, that is, towards Europe, are generally made of iron, while those of the Altai region are generally made of bronze, but the Tagar culture griffin daggers specifically seem to have been bimetallic, being made of both iron and bronze, and it seems to have been unique to that particular area. Eventually, though, production centers of bladed weapons moved to the south of the steppe, especially on the western steppe, and the stylization of daggers began to change once more. Across the steppe they became far more animalistic, but they shrank in size and they increased in detail, becoming almost purely ornamental, and the griffin daggers began to be supplanted by a new style, known as the Saloka type. After about a century of flourishing, the griffin daggers, which would come to form its own unique typology for archaeologists, fell from use, and by the 4th century, they were no more.